Open up Scene01 in the editor. We set up the game controller as a game object that we want to persist across scenes. It is not sufficient to make a copy of the game controller to place in each scene because the values of the UI elements need to remain unchanged from scene to scene. Similarly, properties set in the game controller script, such as the health property, also need to persist across scenes. So we do not want multiple copies of the game controller, we just want one game controller that is always there, regardless of what scene is loaded. The first question to ask ourselves is, do we want the pause functionality to be available on the splash scene? I think so. I could imagine wanting to access the game settings from the splash scene before starting the game. I may even add a button on the splash screen to allow the player to access the game settings without having to press escape. Because the splash scene is the initial scene that will have the game controller, a good first step may be to move the game controller to that scene. Right-click on the game controller and choose Copy. Then open the splash scene, and right-click in the hierarchy and paste. If we open up the game controller, under Game Canvas, we see the Load panel. We see another Load panel if we open up the canvas that was already in the scene. In our game, let's make the Load panel be the same between every scene. So it makes sense that we keep the Load panel that is in the game controller since it will be persistent across scenes. Let's right-click on the other Load panel and choose Delete. Save this scene and then reopen Scene01. Right-click on the game controller and select Delete. We do not need this game controller because we will be setting the game controller from the splash scene to remain in every scene. Save this scene and return to the splash scene. There is no doubt we would have errors if we tried to run either scene. Let's begin resolving those errors now, starting with the splash scene. If I show the console and then press play, I'm actually surprised that we only have one error. There is a null reference exception on line 145 of our game controller script. Double-click on the error to open up the script. Let's scroll down to line 145 and see what property might not have a value. The only property referred to on this line is the FPS controller. Did we not give it a value? Let's scroll to the top and see where we defined the FPS controller property. I see here that it was declared as a private property, so I know the value is not being set in the editor. If we look in the start method, I see we are attempting to give it a value here by searching the scene for a game object with a name of FPS controller. Well, our splash scene does not have an FPS controller game object. What should we do? We cannot remove this code because it will be needed in all the other scenes that have an FPS controller. Going back to line 145, wouldn't it be nice if we could run this line of code only if there is an FPS controller? Well, you're in luck. We can do exactly that. Just write if FPS controller is not null before the command. Let's save and return to Unity. Stop the game if it is still playing. I'll press clear in the console to clear away the old error. When I press play now, the error is gone. I cannot press the start button because the water panel is covering up the title panel. I also see the HUD panel is showing as well. In the hierarchy, under Game Canvas, we see that the water panel and HUD panel are indeed enabled, and the load panel has been disabled. We need the water panel and HUD panel to be disabled as well. It took a bit of searching, but I found the code that was hiding the load panel. It was in the Start Button behavior script that was attached to the Start button. This is not a very good place for the code because hiding the load panel is not really an expected behavior of a Start button. Yes, a Start button may show the load panel, but you would not expect it to hide the load panel. Let's use Ctrl-X to cut the load panel property from this script and paste it as a property of the game controller class. Then go back to the Start Button behavior script and cut the line of code that is setting the property to the load panel game object and paste it in the start method of the game controller class. Under the start method, add a public method with no return value named showLoadPanel. Inside the method, add loadPanel.setActive to true. For now on, we can call this method when we want to show the load panel. copy and paste the showLoadPanel method to make a new method named hideLoadPanel. Change the code inside this to deactivate the load panel. Back in the Start Button behavior script, we can add a private property of type GameController named GC. Then remove the line in the start method that is deactivating the load panel. We do not need to deactivate the load panel in this start method because we will do so in the GameController's start method. In the loadScene method, replace the line of code that is activating the load panel with gc.showLoadPanel. Save this script and go back to the GameController script. In the start method, after the line that initializes the value of load panel, call the hideLoadPanel method. We will take the same approach with the water panel and HUD panel. Create a private property of type GameObject named WaterPanel, and another private property of type GameObject named HUDPanel. In the start method, set the value of WaterPanel to the GameObject with the name WaterPanel, and set the value of the HUD panel to the GameObject with the name HUDPanel. Under the start method, copy and paste the showLoadPanel and hideLoadPanel methods. Change them so that the first method is named showWaterPanel and activates the water panel, and the other method is named hideWaterPanel and deactivates the water panel. Paste the two methods again and rename the first method to showHUDPanel and change the code so it activates the HUD panel. Change the other method so it is named hideHUDPanel and deactivates the HUD panel. Back in the start method, after the water panel is initialized, call the hideWaterPanel method. And after the HUD panel is initialized, call the hideHUDPanel method. Let's save this and go back to Unity, and let's try running it again.